The Browns were down by 3 with less than 5 minutes left in the fourth quarter when my daughter-in-law ripped the remote out of my hand. "Go back to your room, old man," she said without even looking at me. "This is our living room now." For a second, I honestly thought I'd heard her wrong. The game disappeared from the screen. Some home renovation show popped up instead. A smiling couple was arguing about kitchen cabinets. I just sat there. The remote was still warm from my hand. The worst part wasn't what she said. It was that my son heard every word. Brian was standing in the kitchen, maybe 15 feet away, pouring himself a glass of iced tea. He looked up, looked right at me, then looked back down. Didn't say a thing. Not one word. The room suddenly felt smaller than it had a minute earlier. I slowly pushed myself up from my recliner. My knees complained immediately. Arthritis had been winning that battle for years. Kelsey dropped onto the couch and pulled a blanket over her legs. Like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just kicked me out of the room I'd spent 35 years paying for. I glanced toward Brian one more time. He wouldn't meet my eyes. So I turned and walked down the hallway. Nobody stopped me. Nobody apologized. Nobody even acknowledged what had happened. And somehow that hurt more than the insult itself. I got to my bedroom and closed the door. Not hard. Just enough. Then I sat on the edge of the bed. The silence hit me first. The television was still faintly audible through the wall. The sound of people discussing countertops and paint colors drifted down the hallway. I rubbed my hands together. They were shaking a little. Not from anger, from disappointment. At 67, you learn something strange about getting older. The physical pain isn't always the hardest part. Sure, my back hurt every morning. My knees sounded like a bowl of Rice Krispies. I had enough pill bottles to stock a small pharmacy. But those things weren't what kept me awake at night. Loneliness did. Feeling invisible did. Feeling like you were slowly being pushed out of your own life did. I stared at the dresser across from the bed. A framed photograph sat on top. My wife, Mary. She'd been gone 4 years. Cancer. Fast and cruel. The kind that steals someone before you're ready to say goodbye. I picked up the photo. "Well," I said quietly, "I guess things have gotten worse." Mary was smiling in the picture. The photo had been taken during a trip to Gatlinburg back in 2014. We'd rented a little cabin in the mountains. She'd spent 3 days making fun of my inability to start a charcoal grill. I smiled despite myself. Then the smile faded. Because Mary would have never allowed what had just happened. Not because she was loud. She wasn't. Mary had a way of making people behave without raising her voice. One look from her and Brian would have spoken up immediately. One look and Kelsey would have handed the remote back. Instead, the house felt different now. Not physically. Emotionally. Like I'd somehow become a guest. And guests aren't supposed to complain. I set the photograph back down. Then I opened the nightstand drawer. Inside were old papers. Insurance documents. Tax records. A few cards Mary had given me over the years. One was from our 35th anniversary. I pulled it out. Her handwriting filled the inside. At the bottom she'd written, "Don't let anyone make you smaller than you are." I sat there for a long time staring at that sentence. Maybe 20 minutes. Maybe longer. Eventually I heard footsteps in the hallway. Brian. He knocked softly. "Dad?" I didn't answer immediately. "Dad, can I come in?" "Sure." He opened the door. He looked uncomfortable, like a teenager who knew he'd messed up. "About earlier." I waited. He rubbed the back of his neck. Kelsey's stressed. There it was. Not an apology. An explanation. Those aren't the same thing. I nodded slowly. "Okay." "She's worried about money." "Okay. We've been arguing a lot." I looked at him. "Did you come in here to tell me why she said it?" His face tightened. "No." "Then why are you here?" He didn't answer. Because we both knew the truth. He wasn't there to defend me. He was there to keep the peace. And for the first time, I realized something. Keeping the peace and avoiding conflict aren't always the same thing. Sometimes keeping the peace means sacrificing the person least likely to fight back. That person had become me. Brian sighed. "I just don't want everybody upset." I laughed. Not because anything was funny. because it was such a familiar sentence. He'd been saying versions of it his entire life. When he was 10, when he was 20, when he got married. And now, I understand, I said. He seemed relieved, like he'd completed a difficult task. Good. Then he left. I sat there listening to his footsteps disappear. A few minutes later, I heard laughter from the living room. Kelsey. Brian. The television. Life moving on. Without me. Around 10 that night, I made myself a sandwich. Turkey on wheat bread. Nothing fancy. The kitchen was empty. Everyone had already gone upstairs. I stood there eating while staring through the window above the sink. The backyard looked exactly the same as it had for years. The old maple tree. The deck I'd built myself. The fence Brian and I installed when he was 16. The house hadn't changed. The people inside it had. Or maybe I just finally stopped pretending not to notice. The next morning I woke up before sunrise. Old habits. I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, watched the sun come up over Columbus. At 8:12 a.m., I picked up my phone. The number had been sitting on a sticky note for nearly 2 weeks. I had written it down after a conversation with an old friend. At the time, I wasn't sure why. Now I was. The woman who answered sounded cheerful. Buckeye State Movers. How can I help you today? I looked around the kitchen. The kitchen Mary and I had remodeled together. The house we'd spent decades building. The life we'd created. Then I said something that surprised even me. I need to schedule a move. The woman asked for a date. I looked at the calendar hanging on the refrigerator. The date suddenly felt very important. Tomorrow morning, I said. That soon? Yes. There was a pause. Then she said, we can do that. After I hung up, I sat quietly for a moment. My heart was pounding. Partly from fear, partly from guilt, and partly because for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was actually doing something. Not yelling, not arguing, not making threats, just making a decision. Upstairs, I heard Kelsey walking across the floor. A cabinet door slammed. Life continued as usual, but not for much longer, because they thought I was planning to move out. The truth was far more complicated than that. And by the time they came home from work the next day, nothing in that house would feel the same again. The truth was, I should have seen it coming long before that football game. Looking back now, the remote wasn't the beginning. It was just the moment I finally stopped making excuses. 8 months earlier, Brian had called me on a Tuesday evening. I remember because I was grilling burgers in the backyard. The weather was unusually warm for early spring in Ohio. My phone rang, and when I saw my son's name, I smiled. Back then, hearing from him still felt like a pleasant surprise. Dad? Hey, kid. His voice sounded tense. Can we talk about something? That's usually how bad news starts. A few minutes later, he explained that overtime hours at the warehouse had been cut. Money was getting tight. Their lease was ending. They needed somewhere temporary. Just for a few months. 3 at most. Maybe 4. I didn't even let him finish. Of course. Really? You're my son. I remember how relieved he sounded. I remember feeling good about helping. Truthfully, after Mary died, the house had become too quiet. Some nights I'd catch myself turning on the television just for background noise. Not because I wanted to watch anything, because silence can get heavy when you live alone. So when Brian and Kelsey moved in, the house suddenly felt alive again. The guest room was occupied. There was laughter in the kitchen, shoes by the front door, the smell of coffee in the morning. For a little while, I liked it. I really did. The first month was fine. The second wasn't bad either. Then little things started happening. Little things are dangerous. You barely notice them at first. One Saturday afternoon, I came home from the hardware store and found my recliner pushed into a corner. It had always sat near the front window. That spot had belonged to the chair for almost 15 years. I asked about it. Oh, Kelsey said, the room flows better this way. I remember standing there holding a bag of mulch. The chair looked oddly out of place, but I shrugged. Not worth arguing about. A few weeks later, my tools disappeared from their usual shelf in the garage. Not stolen, just moved. Everything reorganized, without asking. When I couldn't find my socket set, Kelsey smiled. I made the garage more functional. Functional for who? I didn't ask. I already knew. Then came the boxes. Mary's Christmas decorations. Old family albums. A collection of ceramic birds she'd spent 20 years gathering. One day I found them stacked in the basement, neatly labeled, stored away. I stood there staring at them. Kelsey walked downstairs and caught me looking. Oh, I hope that's okay. What is? The decorations. I looked around. Why'd you move them? They were making the house feel cluttered. The house. Not your house. Not Harold's house. Just the house. Funny how a single word can tell you everything. I nodded and let it go. Again. That's what I kept doing. Letting things go. Because conflict takes energy. And at 67, energy becomes valuable. Besides, I told myself she wasn't trying to be cruel. She was younger. Stressed. Worried about money. Trying to build a future. Most of the time, I genuinely believed that. The truth is, Kelsey wasn't some cartoon villain. She wasn't walking around plotting ways to ruin my life. She had good qualities. She worked hard. She paid bills on time. She helped neighbors shovel snow during winter. She brought soup to sick friends. But people don't have to be evil to hurt you. Sometimes they just stop seeing you clearly. And that's what happened. Little by little, I became less of a person and more of an obstacle. Around June, I started noticing another change. Brian was disappearing. Not physically, emotionally. Every time Kelsey wanted something, Brian found a reason to agree. Every disagreement ended the same way. Dad, it's not a big deal. Dad, just let it go. Dad, she's stressed. I can't tell you how many times I heard those words. One evening, I sat alone in the garage after everyone went inside. The place smelled like motor oil and sawdust. For a while, I just stared at an old bicycle hanging from the wall. Brian's first bike. Red frame. Training wheels long gone. And suddenly, I remembered teaching him to ride it. Running behind him down the street. Sweating through my shirt. Pretending not to be terrified he'd crash. The memory hit me harder than I expected. Because that little boy would have defended me. That little boy would have marched right into the living room and told anyone bothering his father to knock it off. I missed him. More than I knew. The next warning sign came from one of my neighbors. Mrs. Donnelly. She'd lived across the street for almost 30 years. Known Mary since the Reagan administration. One afternoon, she stopped me while I was checking the mail. How's retirement treating you? Can't complain. She hesitated, then smiled awkwardly. I ran into your daughter-in-law at Kroger. Yeah? She mentioned you were living with them now. I blinked. What? Mrs. Donnelly immediately looked uncomfortable. Oh, maybe I misunderstood. But she hadn't. I knew she hadn't. Because 2 days later, I heard Kelsey saying something similar on the phone. I wasn't eavesdropping. She was standing in the kitchen. I was walking past. That's all. Yeah, we're helping him out for now. Helping him out. I nearly laughed. The mortgage had been paid off before she graduated high school. The property taxes came from my account. The homeowner's insurance came from my account. The roof over her head existed because I'd spent 4 decades working in Ohio summers and winters. Helping me out. I kept walking. Didn't say a word. Then came the conversation that stayed with me. The one I couldn't shake. One evening I walked downstairs to get a glass of water. Kelsey was talking to a friend on speakerphone. She didn't realize I could hear her. He can't live alone forever. A pause. Then she continued. Honestly, assisted living might be better eventually. Not angry. Not cruel. Matter of fact. Like she was discussing lawn care. The thing that bothered me wasn't what she said. It was how easily she said it. As if my future had become a planning discussion. As if I wasn't part of the conversation. That night I barely slept. I kept staring at the ceiling. Thinking. Wondering. Questioning myself. Maybe she was right. Maybe I was getting older. Maybe I was becoming difficult. Maybe I was overreacting. That's the strange thing about disrespect. When it happens slowly enough, you start doubting your own instincts. Then something happened that removed every last doubt. 3 days before the football game, I was scrolling through Facebook. Mostly pictures of grandchildren, fishing trips, and people arguing about politics. Normal stuff. Then I saw a listing on Facebook Marketplace. An antique porcelain lamp. Hand-painted. Blue flowers. I recognized it instantly. Mary's lamp. The one her mother had given her. The lamp sitting in our guest room for 20 years. My stomach dropped. I clicked the listing. Seller's name, Kelsey. I sat there staring at the screen. Then I found another item. And another. A decorative mirror. An antique sewing box. A vintage side table. All Mary's. All listed for sale. Without anyone asking me. Without anyone telling me. Without permission. For the first time, I wasn't hurt. I was angry. And that anger stayed with me all the way to the following Sunday. The football game. The remote. The living room. The moment everything changed. Because by then, I had already started wondering whether the house still felt like home. What happened next would answer that question completely. The morning after the football game, I wasn't acting on impulse. That's probably the biggest misconception people have when they hear this story. They imagine an angry old man making a rash decision. That wasn't me. The truth is, by the time I called Buckeye State Movers, I'd spent weeks thinking about what was happening inside my own house. And for the first time in my life, I was finally preparing instead of reacting. The movers arrived at 9:30 sharp. 3 guys. Blue shirts. White truck. One of them looked young enough to be my grandson. The crew leader introduced himself as Mike. Nice guy. Firm handshake. Professional. You Harold? That's me. He glanced toward the house. What are we moving today? I looked at the front porch for a second. Then at the truck. My life. He laughed. I didn't. A second later, he realized I wasn't joking. The smile faded. Well, he said gently, let's take good care of it. I appreciated that. By then, Brian and Kelsey had already left for work. The house was quiet, the way it used to be before they moved in. Only now it felt different, like the quiet was waiting for something. The movers started with the easy stuff. Boxes, photographs, personal records, the contents of my home office. I carried what I could. Not much. My back wasn't what it used to be. Neither were my shoulders. Every trip up and down the stairs reminded me of that. At one point, Mike caught me trying to move a heavy box. He took it from me immediately. I got it. I can still lift things. I'm sure you can. He smiled. But today you're paying me. Fair enough. Around 10:30, they reached the living room. My recliner sat near the front window. Not where it belonged originally, but close enough. I'd spent thousands of hours in that chair. Football games, Christmas mornings, conversations with Mary, late-night movies, recovery after knee surgery. The thing practically knew my life story. Mike pointed at it. Taking this? Absolutely. The younger mover grinned. Looks comfortable? It better be. As they carried it out, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not sadness. Not anger. Relief. Like I was finally rescuing pieces of myself. The next item was harder. Much harder. Mary's cedar chest. The movers found it at the foot of our old bed. The same place it had sat for decades. Inside were things that probably meant nothing to anyone else. Old letters. Family photographs. Birthday cards. Ticket stubs. Recipes. Tiny pieces of an ordinary life. The kind of things people keep because they matter. Not because they're valuable. I walked over and placed my hand on the lid. The wood felt smooth beneath my fingers. Mary used to polish it every spring. I could almost smell the lemon oil. For a second, I forgot the movers were there. Forgot everything. It was just me and 40 years of memories. Sir? Mike's voice brought me back. You okay? I swallowed. Nodded. Yeah. I wasn't, but I would be. Eventually. Let's take it. They carefully carried the chest outside. I followed them. Slowly. The morning sun felt warm on my face. The truck door closed. And for the first time that day, my eyes filled with tears. Not because I was losing something, because I was protecting it. There's a difference. Most people don't understand that until later in life. Around noon, I sat on the porch steps eating a sandwich from Subway. Turkey. No mayo. Doctor's orders. The movers were loading the garage. Tools. Storage cabinets. My workbench. The old one Brian and I built together 20 years earlier. I watched them dismantle it piece by piece. That part hurt. Not because of the wood. Because of the memory attached to it. I remembered Brian at 17. Hammer in hand. Missing nails. Laughing every time he messed up. Back then, he still wanted to spend time with me. Funny how life works. The phone rang. Attorney Martha Green. I answered immediately. Hello? How's the move going? Expensive. She laughed. That's moving for you. Martha had been handling legal matters for me since Mary's illness. Smart woman. Straight shooter. The kind of attorney who spoke plain English. Not legal jargon. What did you find out? I asked. There was a brief pause. Then her voice became more serious. I spoke with a contractor this morning. My stomach tightened. And? He remembered meeting Kelsey. I sat up straighter. When? About 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks. Before the football game. Before the remote. Before everything. What was the meeting about? Another pause. Then Martha answered. Home renovation plans. I stared across the yard. At the maple tree. At the fence. At the deck. Everything suddenly felt very still. What kind of renovation? The contractor says she wanted estimates. Estimates for what? My grip tightened on the phone. Martha sighed. Converting your bedroom. I didn't speak. For several seconds I couldn't. Into what? A nursery. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because of the room itself, because of what it meant. My bedroom wasn't empty. I wasn't dead. I wasn't in assisted living. I wasn't gone. But she'd already started planning for a version of the house that didn't include me. The contractor apparently assumed everyone was on the same page. He thought she was discussing future possibilities. Maybe she was. Maybe she wasn't. Either way, the message was clear. She saw herself living there. Long-term. Permanently. Martha continued. Harold? I'm here. You okay? I looked toward the house. Toward the bedroom window. The room Mary and I shared for nearly 40 years. The room where we'd stayed up talking after Brian was born. The room where she held my hand during chemotherapy. The room where she took her last breath. And someone was already measuring it for new paint colors. No, I said honestly. I'm not okay. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then Martha said something important. Harold, yeah? You aren't overreacting. I closed my eyes. Because part of me had still been wondering. Part of me still wanted to believe I was imagining things. That maybe age was making me sensitive. Maybe loneliness was clouding my judgment. Maybe I was being unfair. Martha ended that uncertainty with one sentence. They've already started planning a future that doesn't include you. The movers finished around 3 o'clock. The truck was nearly full. My belongings would spend a few days in storage before moving to a furnished rental Martha had helped me locate. Not forever. Just long enough. I took one final walk through the house. The rooms looked different. Lighter. Barer. Almost unfamiliar. The walls where family photographs once hung showed pale rectangles. The living room felt hollow. The bedroom echoed slightly. For the first time, I understood something. The movers hadn't emptied the house. They'd exposed it. Exposed what belonged to me. And what didn't. As I locked the front door behind me, my phone buzzed. A text from Brian. Just 3 words. Everything okay? I stared at the screen, then slipped the phone back into my pocket without answering. Because in a few hours, he'd discover that nothing was okay, and neither would the house he thought would always be waiting for him. I was sitting at Ray Alvarez's kitchen table when Brian and Kelsey came home. I know the exact time because I looked at the clock when my phone started vibrating. 5:43 p.m. Ray had just set a bowl of chili in front of me. Nothing fancy. Ground beef, beans, onions, and cornbread on the side. The kind of meal that fixes more problems than people realize. You gonna eat that? Ray asked. I was staring at my phone. Brian calling. Then again. Then again. I turned the screen over. Nope. Ray nodded. Good. We'd been friends for almost 30 years. Long enough that neither of us wasted words. The phone rang again. Then again. Then again. Finally, Ray chuckled. Looks like somebody got home. I couldn't help smiling. A little. Not much. Because despite everything, my stomach was tied in knots. That's the thing nobody tells you about standing up for yourself. It doesn't always feel powerful. Sometimes it feels awful. Sometimes you sit at a friend's kitchen table wondering whether you've just destroyed your relationship with your own child. I picked up my spoon. The chili smelled good, but I wasn't hungry anymore. The phone kept buzzing. By 6 o'clock, there were 11 missed calls. By 6:30, there were 17. When the voicemail notification arrived, I finally listened. Dad? Brian sounded confused. Not angry. Confused. What's going on? A pause. Dad, call me. Another pause. Where are all your things? I deleted the message. Not because I didn't care, because there was nothing to say yet. A few minutes later, another voicemail arrived. This time, Kelsey. Her voice was sharper, more emotional. Harold, where did everything go? I noticed she didn't call me Dad. Not that she ever really had. Please call us. Then she hung up. By 7 o'clock, the count had reached 23 missed calls. 23. Funny. For months, I'd been living under the same roof as them and barely getting a conversation. Now suddenly everyone wanted to talk. Ray pushed a basket of cornbread toward me. Eat. I'm trying. No, you're worrying. I laughed despite myself. You always were a terrible listener. You always were a terrible liar. That made me laugh harder. For the first time all day, the tension eased a little. Then my phone rang again. Brian. I finally answered. Hello. The silence on the other end lasted nearly 3 seconds. Dad? Yeah. Where are you? With Ray. Another pause. Then, what happened? I leaned back in the chair. The kitchen smelled like chili and coffee. The sun was beginning to set outside. What do you mean? All your stuff is gone. I know. Dad. His voice cracked slightly. What is this? I looked at Ray. He pretended not to listen. Poorly. I moved my belongings. Why? The question surprised me. Not because he asked it, because he genuinely sounded confused. As if the answer wasn't obvious. As if Sunday never happened. As if the previous 8 months had never happened. I spoke carefully. Brian. Yeah? Do you remember the football game? Silence. Long silence. Then, Dad, do you remember it? Yes. Good. That was all I said. Because it was enough. Another long pause followed. Then he quietly said, I should have said something. The honesty caught me off guard. Not because he admitted it, because it was the first honest thing I'd heard from him in a long time. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to forgive him immediately. Part of me wanted to tell him everything was okay. Part of me wanted my son back. But wanting something doesn't make it true. We'll talk later. Then I hung up. The phone stayed quiet for almost 20 minutes. Then another call came. Not Brian. Not Kelsey. Mrs. Donnelly. I answered. Hello? Her voice sounded amused. Well? What? You seem to have caused quite a stir. I smiled. Apparently word traveled fast. What happened? She laughed. Oh, your daughter-in-law posted online. I rubbed my forehead. Of course she did. What'd she say? Mrs. Donnelly cleared her throat dramatically. My father-in-law suddenly abandoned the family home and removed everything without warning. I couldn't help laughing. Even Ray looked interested now. That's one version. Apparently. What happened next? Now Mrs. Donnelly laughed for real. The comments happened. That got my attention. Comments? Harold, half this neighborhood remembers you building that house. I leaned back. What did people say? She began reading. One neighbor reminded everyone that I'd lived there since the late 80s. Another posted photos from a block party 10 years earlier. Someone else shared pictures of me rebuilding the deck after a storm. The more people commented, the worse Kelsey's story looked. Nobody was attacking her. That wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was that everyone already knew the truth. You can't rewrite 35 years of history with one Facebook post. Mrs. Donnelly eventually sighed. People remember, Harold. What do you mean? The work, the house, Mary. I looked down at the table. Her name still hit me the same way every time. You and Mary were part of this neighborhood long before any of this. For a second, I couldn't speak. Because she was right. Some things matter more than ownership papers. Reputation. History. The people who watched your life unfold. Those things stay. After we hung up, Ray poured us both coffee. The old-fashioned kind. Strong enough to wake the dead. We sat quietly for a while. Then he asked, "You okay?" I considered lying. Didn't. No. He nodded. Good. I laughed. Good? Means you're human. That was Ray. Never sentimental. Never dramatic. Just honest. The next morning I woke up on the pull-out couch in his den. My back hated me. My knees hated me. My neck hated me. Getting older is basically a competition between body parts to see which one complains first. I shuffled toward the kitchen. Coffee was already brewing. Ray had been awake for an hour. Retired men treat mornings like a competitive sport. I was pouring my first cup when my phone buzzed. Voicemail. Brian again. This one sounded different. Not confused. Not defensive. Scared. Dad. A long pause. Then, I think I made a terrible mistake. I listened carefully. His breathing sounded uneven, like he'd been pacing. Kelsey met with a contractor. I froze. What? The voicemail continued. There are emails. Another pause. Then, Dad, I didn't know. I stared at the phone. Very slowly, I sat down. The kitchen suddenly felt quiet, because now Brian had seen it too. The thing I'd been seeing for months. The future being planned without me. And for the first time, he couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. I replayed the message. Then again. Ray looked over. Bad news? I shook my head. No? He raised an eyebrow. Sounds like bad news. I took another sip of coffee, then looked out the window. The sun was rising over Grove City, bright and clear. For the first time in a long while, I felt something shift. Not victory, not revenge. Something else. The truth. And once people finally start seeing the truth, everything changes. 2 days later, I agreed to meet them. Not because I was ready, because avoiding the conversation forever wasn't a solution. Brian had called several more times. Each message sounded different from the one before. Less defensive, more honest. Kelsey, on the other hand, had gone completely silent. That worried me. People usually get quiet when they're either thinking or losing control of the story. The meeting happened at Mrs. Donnelly's house on a Thursday evening. That part was intentional. I didn't want lawyers' offices. I didn't want restaurants. And I definitely didn't want my house. Mrs. Donnelly's place felt neutral. Safe. Mary had spent countless afternoons there drinking coffee and gossiping about people who deserved it. If there was any place where difficult conversations could happen without turning into a circus, it was there. The gathering was small. Just 7 people. Mrs. Donnelly, her husband Frank, my attorney Martha, Brian, Kelsey, me, and Ray, mostly because he refused to let me walk into the situation alone. I'll sit quietly, he promised. That promise lasted maybe 15 minutes. We were all seated in the living room when Martha opened a folder. Nobody looked comfortable, especially Brian. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept much. Kelsey looked different too. Not angry, not confident, nervous. For the first time since she'd moved into my house, she looked unsure of herself. Mrs. Donnelly broke the silence. Would anyone like coffee before we start? Nobody answered. Wonderful, she said. We're already off to a great start. Even Martha smiled. The tension eased slightly. Then Martha got straight to the point. Harold asked me to review a few concerns regarding the house. Kelsey crossed her arms. Brian stared at the floor. Martha continued. The issue isn't ownership. She tapped the folder. That's very clear. No argument there. The deed was in my name. The taxes were in my name. The insurance was in my name. That wasn't the problem. The problem was everything else. Martha pulled out several documents. Emails. Contractor estimates. Notes from consultations. Nothing illegal. Nothing criminal. But enough to paint a picture. A very uncomfortable picture. One contractor had prepared a rough design for converting my bedroom. Another had discussed removing built-in shelving from my office. A third had been asked about expanding the master suite. The common theme was obvious. Every plan assumed I would no longer be living there. The room went quiet. Kelsey stared at the paperwork. Brian looked physically sick. Finally, he turned toward her. You really did this? His voice sounded small. She didn't answer immediately. Then, Brian, no. He shook his head. You told me those were just ideas. They were. You never said they involved Dad's room. The conversation was moving exactly where it needed to go. Not toward shouting. Toward honesty. Kelsey looked at me for the first time that evening. Then she looked away. I noticed something then. For months I'd viewed her as the person who caused all of this. Maybe she had. Partly. But sitting there now, she looked less like a villain and more like someone who had lost perspective. That doesn't excuse anything. It just makes it human. Eventually, Martha closed the folder. I think the documents speak for themselves. Nobody disagreed. The silence lingered. Then Kelsey surprised everyone, especially me. She started crying. Not dramatically. Not the kind of crying people do when they're trying to manipulate a room. Real crying. Quiet. Embarrassed. Frustrated. I was scared. Nobody spoke. So she continued. We were barely making rent. She wiped her eyes. I kept thinking about what would happen if Brian lost more hours. Another pause. I kept thinking about never owning anything. For the first time, I understood something important. Her behavior hadn't started with greed. It had started with fear. Fear simply grew into something uglier. I wasn't trying to hurt you, she said. I looked at her. Then what were you trying to do? That question seemed to hit harder than any accusation, because she couldn't answer immediately. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. And I believed her. Not completely, but enough. Mrs. Donnelly leaned forward. Kelsey. The younger woman looked up. Do you know why Mary loved Harold? The question came out of nowhere. Kelsey blinked. No. Mrs. Donnelly smiled sadly. Because he spent his whole life taking care of other people. The room became very still. He took care of Mary. She pointed toward Brian. He took care of that boy. Then she pointed toward me. The problem is that people who spend their lives taking care of everyone else eventually get treated like they'll never stop. Nobody interrupted. Nobody needed to. The truth was sitting in the room with us. Then came the moment I'd been carrying around for days. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out an old photograph. The edges were worn. The colors faded. But the image was still clear. I handed it to Brian. His eyes widened immediately. Oh, wow. The picture had been taken in 1989, the year we bought the house. The garage wasn't finished yet. The siding wasn't complete. The landscaping was mostly dirt. Mary stood smiling beside a ladder. 8-year-old Brian held a paintbrush almost as tall as he was, and I stood in the middle looking about 20 years younger and 30 pounds lighter. Everyone studied the photo. Nobody spoke. Then I finally said what I'd come there to say. You know what scared me most? Brian looked up. I tapped the photograph. It wasn't losing the house. The words came slowly, steadily. It was losing my son. Brian lowered his eyes. I could see the impact immediately, because deep down he already knew. For months he'd been avoiding conflict, trying to keep everyone happy, trying to stay neutral. The problem is that neutrality has a cost. Eventually someone pays for it. In this case, that someone had been me. A few seconds passed. Then Brian did something I hadn't expected. He stood up, walked across the room, and hugged me, the same way he used to when he was younger. Hard, without hesitation. "Hey, Dad?" His voice broke. "I'm sorry." I closed my eyes. Not because everything was fixed, because it wasn't, not even close. But for the first time in a long time, my son sounded like my son again. When he finally sat back down, I looked at both of them. Then I spoke as calmly as I could. "You need to find another place to live." Neither argued. Neither protested. "I'll give you 60 days. Brian nodded. Kelsey nodded too. There was sadness in her face. Relief too. Maybe because pretending had finally become harder than telling the truth. As the meeting ended, people slowly stood. Coffee cups were collected. Papers were packed away. The crisis that had been building for months finally felt real, but not devastating. Just necessary. And as I walked out of Mrs. Donnelly's house that evening, I realized something. Revenge wasn't what I felt. Relief was. 3 months later, I was sitting in my recliner watching a Browns preseason game when I realized something strange. The house was quiet again. Not empty. Just quiet. And there was a difference. When Mary first passed away, the silence had felt like a wound. Every room reminded me of what was missing. The kitchen table. The hallway. The bedroom. Even the laundry room. Every corner carried a memory. Back then, silence felt lonely. Now it felt peaceful. Maybe not every day. Maybe not every hour. But most days. And at 67, peace starts becoming more valuable than excitement. The 60 days I'd given Brian and Kelsey had come and gone. To their credit, they didn't fight me. They found a rental on the east side of Reynoldsburg. Small place. Nothing fancy, but it was theirs. The move itself happened without drama. No screaming. No threats. No last-minute arguments. Just boxes, furniture, moving trucks, and acceptance. Honestly, that surprised me. I'd spent weeks expecting another battle. Instead, something different happened. Reality finally caught up with everyone, including me. The day they moved out, Brian stayed behind for a few minutes. The truck was loaded. The driveway was nearly empty. He stood beside his pickup, looking nervous. "Dad?" "Yeah?" "I don't know how to fix this." I leaned against the garage wall. "Neither did I." "Maybe you don't." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means some things don't get fixed." The words hurt to say, because they were true. Trust doesn't come back overnight. Respect doesn't magically reappear. Relationships don't heal because somebody says sorry once. Healing takes time, and time isn't something you can rush. Brian nodded slowly. Then he surprised me. Again. "I'll keep trying." I looked at him. Really looked at him. For the first time in months, he wasn't avoiding responsibility. He wasn't blaming Kelsey. He wasn't making excuses. He was simply telling the truth. And truth is where healing starts. After he left, I stood alone in the driveway. The house behind me felt bigger somehow. The air felt lighter. Then I went inside and discovered something unexpected. I hated it. The quiet. The empty rooms. The absence of footsteps. The lack of activity. For the first few weeks, I questioned everything. Had I overreacted? Had I pushed too hard? Was being right worth being alone? Those thoughts showed up mostly at night, usually around 2 in the morning. When the house creaked, when the refrigerator hummed, when there was nobody else around. Those were the hardest moments. Not the confrontation, not the moving trucks, not the arguments, the silence afterward. Ray helped. A lot. He dragged me out of the house whenever possible. Breakfast at a diner, fishing trips, hardware store runs. One Thursday he showed up with a ridiculous idea. "You need a hobby." "I have hobbies." "You have television." "Football is a hobby." "No." He pointed at me. "Football is avoidance." I hated how often he was right. A week later, he convinced me to start volunteering at a local community workshop. Mostly retired guys helping repair furniture for families who couldn't afford replacements. Nothing glamorous, just practical work. Tables, shelves, chairs. The first day I almost didn't go. The second day I stayed 3 hours. The third week I actually started looking forward to it. Funny how purpose sneaks back into your life when you're not paying attention. Meanwhile, Brian kept showing up. Not constantly, not excessively, just consistently. Sometimes we'd grab lunch. Sometimes we'd work on small projects. Sometimes we'd sit on the porch drinking coffee and barely talk. Oddly enough, those quiet visits meant more than long apologies ever could. One Saturday morning, he stopped by with a toolbox. "The kitchen faucet still leaking?" I smiled. "Maybe. Let's fix it." For the next 2 hours, we worked side by side, like we used to. Not talking much, just working. The way fathers and sons often do. At one point, he crawled under the sink. I handed him a wrench. A minute later, he said, "Dad, can you pass me the channel locks?" Simple sentence. Nothing special. Except it felt special. Because it sounded normal. Natural. Like the years before all the tension. The years before everybody started walking on eggshells. The years when we were simply father and son. Later that afternoon, while cleaning up, Brian hesitated. Then he asked, "Do you think Kelsey is a bad person?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it carefully. Long enough that he knew I was taking it seriously. Finally, I shook my head. "No." "Really?" "No." I sat down on the workbench. "I think she got scared." Brian listened quietly. "I think fear turned into entitlement." I shrugged. "And I think entitlement turned into disrespect." He nodded slowly. "That's fair. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But it was honest." As for Kelsey, I only heard bits and pieces after that. Apparently, she and Brian were taking some time apart. Not officially divorced. Not officially together. Just figuring things out. I didn't celebrate that. There was no joy in it. Families are complicated. People make mistakes. Sometimes big ones. The goal was never to destroy anyone. The goal was simply to stop allowing myself to disappear. One Sunday afternoon in early fall, I found myself sitting in the living room again. The same room. The same house. The same football team breaking my heart. Some things never change. The Browns were losing. Naturally. I reached for the remote sitting beside my chair and laughed. Because there was a strip of masking tape across the back. Written in black marker were 2 simple words. Harold's remote. Ray had done it as a joke a few weeks earlier. I'd left it there. Every time I saw it, I smiled. Not because of the remote, because of what it represented. A boundary. A small one. A silly one. But a boundary all the same. I looked around the room. Mary's photograph sat above the fireplace. The cedar chest was back where it belonged. My chair sat near the window. Sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor. And for the first time in years, I felt completely at home. Not because nobody would ever hurt me again. Life doesn't work that way. Not because every relationship was repaired. Some scars remain. But because I finally understood something. I didn't win by taking anything away from anyone. I won by refusing to give away pieces of myself anymore. If you've ever had to set a boundary with someone you love, you probably know how difficult it can be. Sometimes the people closest to us are the ones we struggle to stand up to. But peace matters. Respect matters. And no matter how old we get, those things are still worth protecting.